Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining you. Sunday, August 10th, our record date. And we're not talking IU football or IU basketball, at least not directly on this one, although we'll have a couple of quick mentions of both very shortly. But first, Scott, happy weekend. It's almost over now, unfortunately. But
Sunday afternoon, you can't wish me happy weekend. We're almost done.
Well, it's still part of the weekend.
Yeah,
I mean, if I wish you on Friday afternoon, good weekend, you'd be like, oh, thanks. But it's in the weekend. You have a problem with that.
I wouldn't wish you good week on Friday afternoon. But no, we're getting there. We have like 2 or 3 more weekends without football. And then it just starts. You got college football, you got NFL. It's coming.
It's one more weekend without football because the weekend of the 16th, 17th, no football. But Kansas State and Iowa State are heading to Dublin to play in Farmageddon in Ireland on the 23rd. So, or not the 23rd, the 23rd. Yeah, it's right around the corner. So it is really close. And of course, IU football starts on the 30th, and then the NFL starts a couple weeks after that. So it's upon us, my friend.
Yep. Yeah. The dog days of summer are almost over.
Yeah. So we are, of course, going to be here throughout the entirety of August talking about IU football. We've got some new shows launching as well. We did want to remind you folks, if you didn't hear the announcement before, we announced finally that we are going to be doing a live podcast from the Buskirk-Chumley Theater on Friday, September 5th. Doors at 6:30, and the show starts at 7. We'll be up for about an hour and a half. Planning on having some guests. Going to talk football. Going to have a Q&A with the audience. We're going to just a fun evening all the way around. Hopefully, at that point, celebrating a big win the previous weekend against Old Dominion, and we'll be previewing not just the Kennesaw State game.
I really hope so.
I would hope so, yes. But also we'll be previewing the rest of the season, talking about where IU football sits and how things are looking across the country. Tickets are on sale right now. There'll be a link to that at the bottom of the video or the podcast, wherever you're watching or listening to it. Tickets about $15.50 a pop, and that helps to go support the Buskirk-Chumley Theater. And we hope that you will take advantage of that. We've already had some ticket sales, which is nice. And we'd love to see you folks out there if you're going to be in Bloomington, or if you're already in Bloomington and you'd like to come join us. Again, Buskirk-Chumley Theater, Friday, September 5th, doors at 6:30, podcast at 7, and we'll have a meet and greet somewhere in town immediately afterwards. We're looking forward to seeing you folks.
And for anybody going in the first couple rows, I mean, we haven't really planned out what we're doing yet, but I don't think it's going to be a Gallagher style concert where we're smashing watermelons and stuff. So should be good. No ponchos needed. You're good. Early mid-80s reference to comedian.
You reference Gallagher? I mean, wow.
We got having special guest. Maybe Gallagher will be there. Don't know.
You bringing Yakov Smirnoff out after that? I mean, what's going on?
Wow, in Russia, they pay me to do concerts.
Right, yes, and whatever. Anyway, quick reminder, also, we are brought to you here on CrimsonCast and the rest of the Back Home Network by Home Field Apparel, and they have a new box of IU apparel that's out, and you can order it, and it looks amazing. Be sure to go. The what?
All the logos.
All the logos. The platinum box for 2025. It's ready for you, folks. You can go order it right now and have it shipped to you by the start of football season. And if you haven't ordered from Home Field yet, use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order. HomeFieldApparel.com, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. All right, Scott, this is part 2 of a podcast that we started about a month ago. And there may be a part 3 as well, but we wanted to try to wrap up the loose edges or loose ends from the summer because we have several podcasts. There's actually one floating podcast that we're still planning on doing, which will hopefully be next weekend, so keep an eye out for that. But we talked about the foundations of youth sports in the United States, and we talked about the way that has manifested itself over the course of time, what's changing, how the system works, why the system is the way it is. And so if you haven't had a chance, I'd recommend going back and listening to that podcast from a few weeks ago. I'll drop a link in the Substack, or I'll also have a link in the YouTube. But I got a lot of comments from people, Scott, who had started listening to that or listened to the whole thing. And they were like, wow, I'm glad you guys are tackling this. This is a really fascinating topic. It is really interesting to think about how much youth sports touches so many people's lives amongst our audience. It's either you were a participant in youth sports, and so you've got a clear memory of how that was, or you're a parent that's got children in youth sports, or you're like me and you research these things and you try to figure out like how it fits into the larger fabric of society. And so on the last podcast, what we talked about was essentially how we got to the position that we're at, and a lot of the examples of why the current system might not be great, but it also might not be the worst thing in the world that it's not optimized, but we're also concerned about the direction that it's headed. So I guess coming out of that first episode, was there anything that really stuck out to you as you had been reflecting on it before we get into some of your particular experiences thus far as being someone on the parenting side of this whole structure?
Just kind of thinking about how singularly unique the college athletic experience or the college athletic infrastructure is in the US, and how it's really, we are the aberration out there, not the norm. That, most other countries have some kind of professionalized sports system, or I'll reference a couple times, like, Norway, I think they had a piece on, Real Sports about this years ago, but, other countries have other ways of doing things where they try and keep it fun, but also train. We're really the only one to kind of tie academics and where you go to school with athletics at such a young age. And so that's kind of what I was thinking back on, is just how it's kind of like us using our own, measuring system. We're kind of out in the wilderness on our own in the world.
Yes. And it's fascinating to think about, because as we talked about before, using education as a barrier essentially to team athletic participation is a very uniquely American thing. And it almost feels like it highlights how we approached it as a society. And it's interesting watching the US kind of pull apart from that a little bit and discover that that system made things kind of neat and tidy, but it also left a lot of things on the table that we probably shouldn't have left on the table. And I think there's a reckoning that's coming at some point in terms of how we need to be thinking about that. So to catch everybody up on that aspect of things, in case you missed that first episode, it's a misconception, I think, in a lot of cases for us to consider education and athletics as needing to be closely tied to one another. But for most Americans, that is the only way we've come to think about it. And as we talked about on that previous show, when you are an athlete at the high school level, even that phraseology indicates some kind of a pre-existing educational experience that goes along with you playing sports. And that's a really odd thing, because as we talked about in Europe and elsewhere, where they have this academy style system, there's school offered, but the focus is on developing your athletic ability, developing your skill set, and putting you down a trajectory where we find out if you really can be an elite athlete or not. And what ends up happening in the United States is that because there's such a close tie between academics and athletics, you end up pushing a whole bunch of people off the table, first in high school, because some people just do not do well academically in high school. They never make grades. And then further at the college level. And this is where I think it's important for us to keep in mind with the team sports, with primarily football and basketball. And I mean, those are really the two main ones when you get to the US. I mean, there are other team sports, obviously, but most of them do not have a pathway that lies directly through college and high school. Soccer maybe a little bit in the US, and that in and of itself is something we need to talk about later. But only 62% of high school graduates in the US enroll in college at all. And the number of people that get a degree in college is significantly lower than that. It's only about 35% of Americans age 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree. So think about that. That means 4 out of every 10 people never go to college.
Right.
And if you think about the athletic ability of people, oftentimes some of our most athletically gifted people are people who don't necessarily have the intellectual capacity or the wherewithal to survive in what we currently classify as the college environment, or may not have the money to be able to go. There's so many elements to education that are completely decoupled from athletic ability. And yet that has been the way that the U.S. has metered this out. And you think about the number of basketball players we've heard rumored, the famous open courts at Rucker Park and elsewhere in New York and other urban areas where you'd have players that just didn't go to school because it wasn't important in their families or because they had flunked out or something. Legendary types of athletes who never got to play team sports because of the routing that you have here. And it's always been fascinating to me to contrast that, especially in basketball, but also in football, with what occurs in, say, baseball, where a similar kind of thing happens. Like, it's very difficult to go get into the minor leagues unless you've at least played in high school, even if you've got a Legion team or an AAU team you're playing. And yet Major League Baseball regularly traffics in drafting and developing players from Latin America, often whom don't have, higher education development or education development above like the 7th or 8th grade. And that's kind of an equivalency that's odd. And it's like, well, it's fine there. We don't mind that, but we do mind it happening within our own country. That points to a real odd psychological aspect of the way that we think about these things. I don't know if we're actually seeing a lot of progress made, Scott, in terms of that perception changing, but I think it's important people understand that it's there and it's very different from what you see elsewhere.
I look at the perception changing in this, and that like the 70s and 80s, when you and I were growing up, and previous to that, everything you said about, some people's inability to get to college is true. But, the athletic scholarship was looked at as like, all right, well, this is the key to allow somebody to get the education that they're not going to be able to get. And like, you go to college, and that was always nice things. Like, you don't get your name in the locker until you graduate. And there's all these kind of, fun stories of guys who, the few who left early, like they would go back years later and get their degree. And at the time, like John Thompson, Bob Knight, there was a lot of coaches, John Chaney at Temple, who preached this, we want guys to stay 4 years, not just because I want them to play 4 years, but because I want them to get their degree. And I want, there's more to life than basketball, and there's going to be more. And over the last 30, to a point where we're at now, where that has morphed, where everyone's just like, oh, you should leave early. Like, that's dumb to stay in college. Like, you should leave and go to the pros. And like, as you were talking about the number of, people who have a degree, most people in the NBA don't, or at least they didn't get it while they were in college. Most players in the NBA did not stay all 4 years, and in fact frowned upon. And very rarely do you hear that case anymore of you should stay in college all 4 years to get that degree. If anything, it's like you should stay in college to keep the NIL money. I mean, it's become just so about the money, which I'm not saying right or wrong. It's just, it is a much different viewpoint. And I don't know the numbers. This is more for you. I think that the number of players in the NBA, the average career length probably hasn't changed since the 80s. So it's like the odds of you going in college 2 years and then, making enough money to live forever out of the NBA is probably still the same percentage now as it was then. But yet we don't seem to care now about people who go to college, just don't get a degree, and then go to the NBA.
Well, I will say, I don't know if it's that we don't care as much as it's like, should we care? And this becomes kind of, it's an interesting philosophical question about how Americans view this versus how Europeans view it and others. But it's also, it sounds callous to say, well, what exactly is it about the athlete that we should care about in terms of them getting an education, when we don't care about that for the dropout who doesn't have athletic skill in high school? That's what I always found fascinating about this mentality. Now, some of it, and what you were talking about with Bob Knight, John Chaney, they were raised in an era where it was like, you have an opportunity to go get an advanced degree at a time when that was still very unusual. And we talked about this on the last show. It wasn't until the GI Bill started to get cashed in that enrollments at higher education institutions skyrocketed across the country. That's when I think we talked about, like, IU didn't clear the 10,000 student enrollment barrier until the mid 1940s, like after World War II ended. This used to be something that only the elite participated in. It used to be something that was not for the vast majority of people, because most jobs in the US didn't require that level of of education. And it's ironic because now it's not just athletes where you're starting to hear less of a concern about this, but it's also this entire anti-college or college is not worth the money and you should go to trade school and become a plumber or an electrician. Again, that's nothing against plumbers and electricians, but you weren't hearing that rhetoric 30, 35, 40 years ago. All you were hearing was you need to go to college because college was this guarantor of economic success that you just couldn't get if you were working a blue collar job, and it was something aspirational. It's become a lot less so. And it is interesting that it's now starting to hit athletics because it's also hitting other areas. But this is where, and the reason why I wanted to reset us on that is it's fascinating because I don't think there's been quite the realization that when you pull at that thread of we're going to decouple education from athletics in the United States, you're suddenly confronted with a lot of problems in terms of development for athletes at high levels that can compete at a global rate in a bunch of different sports, not just the team sports, because of how central higher education and to some degree secondary education have been to the development of athletes, because there really isn't another way of doing it. And what I mean by all of that is basically this. You've got a circumstance right now in basketball, as we talked about last time, where NBA teams will often look overseas, even college teams. IU just signed two guys from, one from Serbia, one from Bosnia, who look pretty skilled, will probably get a chance to play professional basketball somewhere, whether it's the NBA or a lower level. They've developed effectively, and clearly they are academically sound enough that they can get in to an institution of higher learning. At the pro level, you've got players getting drafted in from overseas pretty regularly. And that should be, I think, an increasing warning sign to not just colleges and universities in the U.S., but the entire basketball system in the U.S. Because when you compare that to the United States' clear issues with competing on the international stage in soccer, and the fact that it's not just a fait accompli that in the Olympics or elsewhere, you're just going to be among the best in what you do or win a gold medal if you're an American. It just shows like the rest of the world in many cases has caught up. And now the U.S. finds itself in this weird spot where youth sports becomes in need of reform because of the training processes needed to maintain the level of dominance that the U.S. has gotten used to historically.
Well, in a way, the universities and high schools kind of served as almost like the public good for athletic training. It's like it was like a police department or a fire department. It was like the public good. They did it where you would have these one-off sports like tennis was just, you would send your kids down to Bolletari's camp, and it was like a for-profit enterprise. And I'm not saying that's bad, but that is where, corruption and bad things can start to come. And that was just like, if you wanted to be good at tennis, you had to go to Florida, and you had to go there when you were 12, and you had to drop out of school, and you had to pay Bolletari a ton of money, and we'll see, like no guarantees. And in a weird way, we're kind of moving toward that across the board, because as you decouple these things, and this is probably off the, but this is like the U.S., Olympic training was so tied into the universities. As you decouple these, you get the youth sports industry, which is now, it's tough because like the other model had its own issues too when you connected it with education. But on the flip side, the youth sports model, we're like, hey, you're going to do travel teams and you're just going to play basketball 12 months a year. And we're just going to continually, use this as a money maker, but also a trainer, but kind of more of a money maker. And there's good teams, there's bad teams, and you got to travel a bunch, and you might have to spend a ton of money. And it almost limits the ability of people. Like you're back to the point where it's like the guys at Rutgers Park, to your original analogy. It's like
Rutgers Park, Scott.
Right. They can't afford.
I do love the alternate scenario where it's actually Rutgers Park and it's just a bunch of guys in New Jersey playing basketball with each other. But please go ahead.
Why is the game's not as good as what I've been hearing about? Where was but it's they are now kind of eliminated from that travel team setup, and it's becoming again back to kind of high level, the elites of just people who have a ton of money, the ability to travel. And it's like, again, this is kind of a US thing. We can't find middle ground. We're always going just polarity to polarity.
Well, and this is where, to some degree, there's a lot of different things colliding at once. And this is where I wanted to get into the parent discussion. But you hit an economic point that I think has to predicate all of this. You mentioned that Real Sports video that was showcasing, what was it? It was at the complex up by where you live,
Grand Park. Yeah.
And there was another Real Sports excavation of this, I think about 6 or 7 years ago, about a similar kind of youth sports park in Columbus, Ohio.
Right.
And what you'll note, and what gets talked about in that Columbus, Ohio piece, or maybe it was Dublin, Ohio, it was one of the suburbs of Ohio, is they talk to the guy who's running it, and he basically is like, well, we're doing this as a service for people that can afford to pay it, is essentially the message. And that actually concerns him, because he knows that there are all of these children who don't have the financial means to pay. And what's interesting is, if you think about education as a barrier for athletic participation, economic barriers work in much the same way that academic barriers do, because there's a pretty clear correlation in most cases between a child's socioeconomic circumstance that they grow up in through their parents, or maybe they don't have parents in the house and they're being raised by a family member, and their ability to have decent enough academic achievement to be able to stay in school and participate. And when you don't have that, and especially when you see that 40% of the population isn't going to college and never has, well, that shoves 40% of the population off the map. Well, this is a similar kind of thing where if you have the means, your child can participate. What's fascinating is, historically, at least over the last 20 years, the way this developed was, if you have a son who you think might be good enough to play a sport that could get them a scholarship at a college, or if you have a daughter who you think could be good enough in volleyball or softball, you look at it as an investment that's worth the potential payoff, even if it doesn't work out. Because if you can get a scholarship, even to a smaller school, well, you've gotten college paid for, and that's a huge economic burden that you don't have to deal with. But for the people who can't afford those things, increasingly and almost universally now, there's no alternative. One of the things in the Real Sports piece from 6 or 7 years ago, if you go to the municipal playgrounds or parks where kids used to play regularly, even when we were in school, like back in the 80s and certainly before that, most of them are in disrepair. Most of them have had budgets slashed. Most of them don't have people attending to them. They're unsafe. They're oftentimes in drug-infested neighborhoods or in just unsafe neighborhoods. And so what it creates is essentially a further winnowing of who can participate in sports. And while that works in a closed system where you don't have outside competition from other societies, what it does is, in the sports like soccer, like basketball, where there are more comprehensive systems in place that don't have all those economic barriers, you suddenly start to fall behind really quickly.
Well, and there was Real Sports did a lot of this, because there was another story they did 6 or 7 years ago, which oddly is not there's only clips available. It's not fully available. Come on, HBO, put it out there. On one of your 27 apps, from HBO Go to not go to HBO Now to not now, Supermax, not Max, just HBO. We'll do it again. Just total horrible branding. They did a story about the Norway skiing youth instruction, and how just completely different it is, because all of these youth sports here, in the US, it's all about tournaments and games and playing a ton and keeping score and having winners and having losers and having trophies. And in Norway, where they have a unbelievable success at skiing, it's up until 16, it's just, we'll have fun. Everybody's allowed to be there. And there's professional coaches and they're coaching, but it's we're not keeping track of times or anything. And we'll do races, and the kids will kind of know where they finish, but we're not giving out medals. It's just for fun. And then at 12 or 13 or 14 is when they're all right, now we'll see who can actually do it. I look at that too, and it's that goes into I'm not even sure the program we have now with the youth sports culture provides the results, because you get a ton of burnout. And then you also get, this is also, so many things tie into this. It's after you had the injuries with, Halliburton and Tatum and a little bit of Lillard, but all of these crazy Achilles injuries, you start looking at is this overuse and kids just playing too much? Which also, again, Real Sports is the Rosetta Stone. This goes back to a Real Sports, another one they talked about with, Tommy John surgery and young kids, and just the idea of, pitchers in these travel teams throwing curveballs when they're 9, 10, 11, 12, 12 years old, again, because they're trying to win, where it's like, these guys are doing Tommy John surgery on 17, 8, 12 and 13-year-old kids. It's like, are you getting overuse injuries because you're playing too much at a competition level?
So part of the issue, and I want to start this segment or part of it by saying the big problem with the European system when you get into things like soccer is that it does leave a ton of people behind who don't make it. People who think they're going to become professional soccer players and they get to age 18 and they're not good enough, and suddenly they basically don't have a future. When you think about, however, the overall setup in sports, there's a bunch of things in the European system and elsewhere that work more functionally better than the current American system. And it's ironically something the American system used to at least do somewhat well and has increasingly not done well. So there's a few things here to throw in. A, as you said, it's a lot more inclusive. It's not, sorry, you don't qualify economically, so we're not going to let you into our club. Or, sorry, your family doesn't have enough money, so you don't get to play on these fields. You've got to go find something that your tax dollars don't even pay for anymore. So that's part of the issue, is that you, as we talked about, not just with the academic barriers that the U.S. has had, but even with that, everybody would at least normally get a chance to go to high school. It wasn't until high school that you would start to see people drop off. But that's a different set of barriers that reduces the number of people that could potentially be discovered as elite athletes or very good athletes that could play at the collegiate level or the professional level. So that's part of the issue. Second issue that you run into is that with most of these travel teams, with most of the high school coaching, there's no licensing. There's very little quality control in terms of what you get with the coaches that you have. A lot of times your qualifications in those cases are, well, I played in college or I played at the pro level, but I'm not actually doing the training. It's somebody I knew in high school or college that's doing the training. It's my name, the brand name on there that's selling it, but it's a business. I'm not actually necessarily out there doing X, Y, and Z. Contrast that with, take soccer training in Europe and in basketball, where there are badges and there are training levels, and you have to, in order to qualify for jobs, have to take tests and have to continually upgrade your knowledge level in order to rise up through the ranks of coaching. That doesn't mean that you can't get great coaches out of a licenseless system. It just means that you could get a coach who isn't very good, and you'll often get coaches who might be good at coaching particular skills, but might be terrible at teaching the holistic elements of the game. And it's why you don't see a lot of skill development in a lot of these. And again, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but when you think about the complaints and the concerns that people have about youth sports in the U.S., a lot of it is there is no real quality control. Oftentimes, parents don't know what they're getting because they're getting sold a vision or a bill of goods on certain things that may not match up with reality. But how are you going to know? You're not an expert in this either.
So I have some experience in this. I coached basketball in Texas. I was a teacher for 5 years, middle school coach, head coach of the basketball team in Texas. It's funny. I got there. You and I took the coaching basketball course with Bob Knight. I had my notebook, but I get there. I was hired as a social studies teacher. And my principal's like, "You're from Indiana." I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "I like Bob Knight. You're a basketball coach." I'm like, "Okay." I guess that's how I'm doing it. But this was right 2000 to 2006, kind of early AAU culture. Again, one point of reference, but I'm coaching 7th and 8th grade in middle school. I'm the head coach. We met every year with the high school head coach, the high school that we fed into. And his directives were very clear. It's like, hey, we run a motion offense. I play man-to-man defense. There's little things like, when a guy's, like we call wolf, when a guy's coming up behind the ball, like just terminology I want to plug in. So when we get your kids as freshmen, it moves in. And he's like, I really don't care if you win or lose. Like, I want your kids to compete. I want them to play hard, but I would much rather your team come in and they know the principles of motion offense than you guys win a division title in middle school, because who really cares about that? Move that to today, where some kids are just playing AAU all the time. And from an AAU's point of perspective, or these travel teams, you kind of have to play to win. Because if you're telling parents like, hey, we're going to go to Buffalo and then Rochester, and then we're going to Dayton, and we're going to fly all these places, Just economically, it's like, I don't want to go and watch my team go 0-25 all year. Like, that sucks. And like, I don't really, if we're just going to learn principles, why are we going to Dayton, Ohio to do that when I live in Indiana? So I think that's part of it. I also think, one of my other, when I was in sales for years too, like one of my things I always try and think of is like, how are you making money off of this? Like, just in the equation, when I'm doing a business deal, like, what's the benefit to the other side? Because there has to be one there. Like, how are they making money? It's also good advice to not get scammed. Someone's like, hey, I'll give you free money. It's like, well, what's your deal in this? But when you think about it, like, again, back to kind of that public good, high schools, colleges, they were just there to provide education and also provide athletics. And they would get a benefit if a player went to the next level. It's like, oh, we're the high school that had, Tyrese Halliburton and Jason Tatum. And you get some of that on the travel circuit, but really how the travel circuit makes money is not that they advance players to the next level. It's that you stay in their system and then you continue to pay them their dues every year. And you continue to fund these travel tournaments, which fund the sites like Grand Park. And that just provides a different level of, instead of, again, not saying that travel coaches can't be good or the system can't work, but it also provides this underbelly where it's like, what's the real goal here? It's like, am I trying to make everybody better? Or if I win a bunch of games and the parents are happy and they sign up again next year and I can raise the prices, maybe I just kind of focus on the wrong things. Like, the last thing I'll say, sorry, I'm talking a lot, is like, I just finished coaching my son who's going into 7th grade, last 2 years in intramurals here in Westfield. And in the 6th grade intramural, you're allowed to do zone defense like 2 quarters of the game. I just never did it. I hated running zone. We had a little tournament at the end. It's like I ran zone for half a game because it's a tournament. But the rest of the season, I'm like, let's play man-to-man, because zone is almost like this weird hack at the younger levels of basketball where it's really tough for kids to play offense against a zone. But it teaches and again, like Jim Boeheim, I'm sorry if you're listening, but zone at a young level just teaches really bad defensive principles. Like, hey, just stay there and just don't move a lot. Whereas man-to-man teaches you to move. And so I look at it kind of like throwing a curveball young, but it's like you see this a lot in travel teams. They run a lot of sets that maybe aren't teaching the best fundamentals, but they're kind of hacks to get you to get wins. And that's where you get into this issue where you have a lot of players who may have the means, maybe in the system, and they're learning kind of all of the wrong things so they get to a level where they need to know, like, how to shuffle on defense, how to get back, and how to, understand your spot in a, help defense situation. They don't know how to do it.
Right. Well, and I just want to clarify, there are licenses available. Whether they're required or not is almost entirely dependent upon what state you're in, what organization is being coached. So, like USA Basketball has a licensing system where you have to become, I think, a USA Gold member or, have that license in order to coach. But that's only if you're affiliated with USA Basketball. Same thing with soccer. Like, they've tried to create a system where there's licensing, but it's no guarantee that you're actually going to be needing that depending on what organization you're coaching for. My point in all of this is not that there aren't great coaches in the US or that there's not certain circumstances where you might have that, but most parents are very ignorant about these spaces to begin with. The kids certainly don't know any better one way or the other in most cases. And what we find is that even when there is licensing involved, and even when you do have some kind of a credential check, it's often, as you just put it, without real direction, because you could be in one community learning one set of things and move to a different community in the same state, in the same metro area, and have an entirely different set of emphases. It's very inconsistent. It's very patchwork. And what it ends up creating is a circumstance where, for a lot of people, they're wasting money and they don't know it at the parental level. And your kid might just be naturally good at sports and not need that coaching. And oftentimes there's things you need to unlock in kids that you might not be able to get to because you're not getting the right coaching. I mean, it's a real issue that oftentimes doesn't get cleared up until much later in the process.
Right. Yeah.
So, I do think that just across the board, and we had I thought some really good comments from Mike Petrie, longtime friend and listener and occasional guest on the pod. But, he made the note the following, which I thought that were worth mentioning. So one thing I think works against the skill development model in the U.S. is the sheer scale of the number of players. And we talked a little bit about the population differences on the last show, but I think it's worth reiterating. Like the largest country in Europe by population is Germany, which has about 80 to 85 million people. The U.S. has like 350 million people. It's a huge country. And I mean, you compare it to something like, I think like England has 60 million. I think France has 50 million. I mean, and those are the biggest ones. And then it starts to really go downhill from there. So worth noting. So Mike continues, because there are so many players to sort through, it works to NBA teams' advantage to wait as long as possible before they spend big money on assets. And so that I think is, one of the issues is that, as we talked about before, there probably should be a licensure system that is mandated by the major professional leagues. And those professional leagues should be working in tandem with the national governing bodies of those sports. But everybody knows that the leagues in the U.S. have far more power than the governing bodies. And they don't necessarily want to have to deal with that because they don't want to have to take over the training process, because that is a lot of money.
Right.
It's all about investment at that point, which I'm going to come back to in a second. Another thing that Mike notes, the problems of the U.S. model are that scale dictates everyone in the chain, what the chain values is quantity over quality. An AA coach's value to college coaches is based on how many college-ready players are in the program. At the same time, the value to parents is how many college coaches are looking at the program that they might put their kids into. What's interesting is that football appears more like golf and tennis, where outside coaches and camps are more concerned with individual skill development than competition results. And that you do see that a bit in the draft process. We talked about how unique football is. Football also has the benefit of not having any of those external pressures, as we talked about before. The U.S. isn't competing with anybody to produce football players, and the NFL knows it as a closed system. And as we've seen, a lot of great football players, great NFL players, either play at smaller Division I FBS colleges or sometimes even lower than that. I remember, who was it? Andre Reed, great Buffalo Bills receiver, went to Kutztown State. I was like, where the hell is Kutztown State?
Yeah.
It's a small school in Pennsylvania. But that shouldn't have worked. How did he end up there? You want to take another example?
Last year. I mean, just how many guys came from a low level area. But yeah, I mean, no, Jerry Rice, didn't he play at like a
Mississippi Valley State for Jerry Rice? Elijah Surratt started, I think, at a Division II school,
right,
and went to James Madison, and now he's here. So it is one of the interesting things about football. And again, the scale is important because of how many people you need to play football versus some of the other sports. And that scale thing is a real problem, again, because it is nationwide. And, it does create some problems in terms of trying to come up with a coherent system that works nationally. The problem, I think, Scott, I'd love to hear from you about is so many. A lot of Americans love to have systems that just work, that they don't have to think about.
Right.
And that's not a criticism of Americans. I think it's actually the case with most people everywhere. You really do have to do a lot of research to figure out what you should be getting your kid into at the youth sports level in order to make the right decisions. But you oftentimes neither have enough information on your own, because you don't have the background in it to make the right decisions, nor is the information that you're being presented in any way, shape, or form the right information that you need to actually make the decisions, because it requires you to go essentially scout multiple teams and coaches for 2 or 3 years before your kid gets to that point. Oftentimes while your kid's already playing some other version of youth sports that you already have to keep tabs on. It's really one of those kind of survival of the fittest sorts of environments. And it disadvantages everybody except the service providers at that point, it feels like to me.
100% true. I mean, and the two things that I've experienced, one is, like both of our boys, we signed them up for baseball when they were like 6 or 7 years old. And I was kind of naive. It's like, all right, well, they've never played baseball. Like, this is a great time it was intramural. It wasn't just an intramural baseball league at 6 years old. And like, we get there and half the kids have already had, professional coaching, and like, they all know how to play baseball. And like, my sons didn't do well. They're not particularly awesome at baseball, but it was like, I thought this was to learn baseball. Like, do we need to pre-learn before 6 years old? Like, what's going on? But I find that increasingly in the intramurals around here, and just northern Indianapolis is very, youth sports centric up here. What also I'm finding is, my oldest plays basketball. He's not, he's going to try out this year. We'll see how he does on the basketball. He's not good enough to make the travel teams. But I have some friends who have some daughters who are in soccer, and they're starting to make travel teams. And what you also run into is, like, I personally, let's just say my oldest was good enough to make a travel basketball team, was getting really good at basketball. You kind of can't have your own views on things. Like, I don't believe that anybody should be playing the same sport 12 months a year. But if they were good enough, like my friends who have the daughters in soccer, it's like, they don't really get to make that choice. It's like, well, if you want to be on the travel team, we're 12 months a year, and you sign up, and it's like, you've got to do all these tournaments. And if you miss 2 or 3 tournaments, you're off the team, sometimes without a refund. So like the idea of like, well, I want my kids to play multiple sports through high school. It's like, you kind of don't get that option if your kids are good enough to be in that elite level, because as you said, the service providers kind of have these terms and conditions. We're like, no, this is what we do, because then you're paying 12 months a year. And so you kind of get pushed out in that realm also. But it's tough as a parent, because it's like, I would love to see my kids grow and excel in some sports, but it does feel like, man, I'm running, like, my youngest is 9. It's like, man, I feel like I've run out of time. He's 9. Like, it's stupid, but it's like, I don't have enough time to give him a trial in each one of these. Right. But it's like, at 9, it feels like the kids who are already, pushing ahead, they've already had 4 years in there. So it's like, I can't just start, let's try lacrosse. It's like, well, you're already behind in everything at 6 or 7 or 8, which is nuts.
It is. Well, and it makes me feel bad because, for the number of really good youth coaches that are out there who believe in the right things and really push the right things and have the best interests of the kids that they're working with at heart, oftentimes at the municipal level, it ends up that a lot of the places you're supposed to send your kids, if you think that they've got a shot at making it to the next level of whatever that is, are not necessarily run in a way that is conducive to having a normal life, making normal economical decisions, or not having to choose, as you just said, between this or something else entirely, because you're not willing to commit to the level that somebody else is willing to commit at.
Well, and I'm sure many people in our audience have dealt with this. Like, my friends who are getting into the travel soccer world, they're kind of like, well, we'll be gone for the next 4 months, and like we'll throw out like, hey, we want to go to a concert in November. They're like, we don't have our schedule yet. Like, they don't commit to anything. but it's because of that commitment. And I get it. And I'm not sitting here saying that if my son wasn't good enough in basketball to do that, I might not be doing that for a year or two just to see what it's like. So I'm not at all saying that's not the thing to do. It's just you take a step back, and it's like, man, that is nuts. I mean, we're not even in high school yet. Right. And this is a ton of commitment.
Well, and I guess what concerns me, that's a micro level thing that's really important, but that's happening all over the country. But the macro level is just as important from a cultural perspective. And this is where we probably leave this topic broadly for the 3rd episode, but to kind of tease it, as many problems that individual parents and kids have at this level, at the level you're talking about, that period between maybe 6 and 12, but even beyond that, it all feels like it's directionless. Right. And that really should concern a lot of people in the United States about, if you care about USA anything, USA basketball, USA soccer, USA track and field, so much of what the setup is right now is either still heavily reliant on these pay-for-play types of systems that have developed, where you're not getting the best athletes in at the top of the funnel, so you're not getting them as they pass through the funnel and at the tail end as finished products. But you're also, in many cases, the part where you're actually in the funnel isn't really teaching you the skills that you need to be an elite athlete in that sport when you get to the tail end of things. Now, I'm always amazed at how good the former Yugoslavian republics are at training basketball players. You think about it, like, Luka Doncic and Nikola Jokic, and all of these amazing players that they've had historically coming out of Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, those three especially. That doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it. That's a war-torn area. It's not the richest area in Europe by any means. And yet the training specifically in basketball and also in tennis, when you also consider, Novak Djokovic, who comes out of the exact same setting, like they have been able to come up with a very directionally focused, skill-heavy training process that does, at the end of the day, produce really high-level players in their sports, despite them not fitting any archetype of what we would think of as being great athletes. Like it's hilarious listening to other NBA players talking about Nikola Jokic. He breaks their brains,
right?
Because they look at this guy and he looks like Eric Montross, where it's like that guy shouldn't be
Eric Montross,
right? Yeah, out of shape Eric Montross. Like that guy shouldn't be the best NBA player in the league, but yeah, he's won an MVP. He probably should have won another MVP. He's won an NBA title. He is so skilled and he is so smart and sees the game so well. And the U.S. system, if they can get those types of players, it's almost by accident, because as we've talked about, the U.S. has largely survived off of brute force athletic talent, right, making it through all of these gates to get to the final spot. Now, with basketball is a relatively inexpensive sport to do this in. Where the U.S. needs to be concerned is swimming and diving, track and field, all of these sports that require large facilities, state-of-the-art facilities. And what we're going to talk about in the next episode is how the potential collapse of college sports as we know it really endangers that
Olympic training model.
Because think about the USA swimming and diving team. Like the vast majority of them are coming from where? From Indiana, right, from Texas, from a couple of other schools that have great facilities and are willing to fund these things. Well, we're on the precipice right now of a bunch of schools saying we got to spend $22 million a year on revenue sharing to pay for our football players and basketball players, which we have to have in order to maintain a college athletics department in this environment. We're not going to continue to pay for a swimming and diving program or a gymnastics program. And we've already seen it in some of the more esoteric Olympic sports where those have been. Men's gymnastics is a great example. It's gotten dropped in so many places because of Title IX. So you end up with an almost entirely academy-based system. The one last thing I'll also say, you also deal with a situation where even in football, a lot of schools and coaches are saying, if I'm at Northern Illinois, which I think is actually the coach that said this, or if I'm at a smaller school, why should we spend our time and our money and our effort training players who then move on and go play at a higher level and we get zero compensation in return? And this is where the transfer system comes into play, which is the topic that we'll hit the next time that we do this. So anyway, we'll wrap it up there. Scott, any final thoughts?
No, sounds good. Looking forward to part 3.
We'll be back with part 3 of this eventually. We'll have a lot more IU football talk coming up this week as well. This is CrimsonCast for Scott. I'm Galen. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.